Hi everybody. In this video, I am going to be working with the TouchGui library and creating a two-dimensional slider. So that is a slider that will produce values on both an X and a Y axis. So here I have my boilerplate for the TouchGui library. First thing I need to do is add this line of code into my index.html. That line of code can be retrieved here in the TouchGui library GitHub, which will be provided in the comments below. And then I need to create a variable to hold the GUI object. Once I have that variable, I assign that variable the create GUI object, and then in draw I put draw GUI, and that will get the library up and running. So next thing I would need to do is create a variable that's going to hold this slider value. So I'm just going to call it slider. And then here in setup, I'm going to assign this variable the 2D slider object. So slider equals, and then create, capital S slider, and then 2, and then a lowercase d is what I need for this slider object. All right, so the first thing I need to do is give it the name, which I will just call slider. And then, as with all the objects in the TouchGui library, I'm going to give it an X and Y position. Now, this 2D slider is a little bulky. It's kind of big. And so I'm actually going to widen my canvas on the X-axis a little bit and give myself some room to work with. So I'm going to put this slider at 450 on the x-axis, so it's going to kind of be over here, and I'll still have a 400 by 400 canvas to work with, and then I'm going to put it at 100 down there. So if I press play here, there you can see I have to slide over a little bit, and it's actually went a little farther beyond. So the default size is pretty big, so you can kind of see why I chose to do this. So the next thing I want to do for the slider, and maybe I'll bump it over like to 410. So the next thing, the arguments that I give for the slider, the 2D slider object, are how big I want it on the X and the Y axis. So I'm going to make it a little smaller, but I believe the default is like 200 by 200. I'm going to go 100 by 100 here. So now if I press play, you see it's a much smaller size, and that's a bit easier to work with. So the specifications here are important, so you're not taking up too much size. Okay, now the next thing I want to do for this is the next two arguments are setting the range of values for the slider on the x-axis, which is from left to right. And then the next two arguments would be to set the value from top to bottom, going up and down vertically here. So my idea here is I'm just going to move an ellipse around the canvas and around what would be the 400 canvas here. So I'm going to do between 0 and 400, and then between 0 and 400 as my range for both the left and the right. So now that I have that, I can take these values and apply them to something in my sketch. So I think the first thing I'm going to do, just to visualize this a little better, is I'm just going to make a line to kind of delineate the space that I want my ellipse to move versus where my slider is. So that's going to be starting at 400 and on the X, and then 0 on the Y, and then 400, and then the height canvas here. So if I press play here, so I'm just putting this line here to kind of demarcate where I'm going to have this ellipse moving around, and then kind of separate this little control here, which is something you can consider doing if you're going to work with this library. I kind of like to make a little control panel on the side and kind of a separate spot on the canvas, and then have sort of the canvas that I'm working with here. So now with I'm going to make my ellipse. Okay, so remember, I want the X value of my slider to control the ellipse moving on the X axis of the canvas, and then I want the vertical Y axis of my slider to control that. So I have my slider which I have called slider. So to access those values, I need to refer to that object by name. I'm going to do val, but following val, I'm going to put capital X. So that is obtaining the value of the slider when I'm moving it left to right. Then I'm going to do slider.val capital Y, and that is going to obtain the value when I'm moving the slider up and down. And then I'm just going to make this, let's say 50 in the size of my ellipse. So now I press play, and you see the ellipse appears there. And now I can, if I click and move, the ellipse is moving around. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that it's kind of moving opposite directions for where I'm at, and that is because the low value is when the slider is down, and the high value is when the slider is up. When I say low and high, what I really mean is the first value that we put here is the bottom, and the second value is the top. So I do need to inverse these so that 400 is actually going to be on the bottom and 0 is going to be on the top. So in this case, it will actually follow the range. And there, you can see I can now move this ellipse around using this two-dimensional slider, which is pretty cool. So that is all there is to it in terms of accessing the values of this slider. So there's plenty of things I could do with this. Also, just something to show you here. Let's say it's always going to default to the mid-range point of both your sliders here, but say we wanted, instead for it to start in the upper left hand corner, we want it to start at 0, 0. So you can initialize the values of your slider as well. So I could just do slider.val x equals 0 when I start, and then slider.val y equals 0 as well. And then that will initialize where my sketch starts out. So now it starts out there, but then once I click, it will just move and follow along in the same way. And that is how we use a 2D slider in the TouchGui library here in P5.js.